Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 48 following episode 9, which was a pretty fun episode that led to a pretty fun downfall here. And I do think there are some things to talk about when it comes to where I think the season is going, but we'll get that soon enough. But we have 9 people to talk about, and as wasting more time, let's get into the video. So starting off at number 9, we have the latest boo from the season, and here we have David. And I thought this was a fun downfall for David here, with him getting a bit too paranoid and him really pushing away a lot of his allies. Also, him coming up short in the immunity challenge where it seemed like he was going to win it until he just suddenly dropped out. Yeah, I'm also getting very upset at losing said immunity challenge and him feeling like he should have won it. And again, I feel like there's a lot of fun to be had there. And by the end, I was pretty confident he was going out, especially when the alternative was Mitch. I was pretty certain that Dave was going out in this spot. And I think if we are looking at Dave more generally, he was definitely one of the bigger characters of the season. And there was a brief point during the season where I did consider him as a contender, even though I was never as high on him as other people were. Though I think by the merge, I was definitely starting to go downhill on him, and I was pretty certain that a downfall was going to come at some point for him down the road. Now, there was definitely a debate over whether he could have been a losing finalist, though I think with the way this episode played out, it was pretty clear he was about to be voted out in this spot. And I do think David is someone who, despite him clearly not knowing the game super well, and despite him not really having watched the show beforehand, he did have the right idea of trying to align with all the big guys and really using that to try to get to the end because of that. Though at the same time, I'm not a big fan of his attitude, where it does seem like he genuinely believes that he is playing this honorable game and that he is genuinely better than everyone else. And you also have him talking in his exit interview about how he's the only one who wasn't fake and how jury management is something that real people don't do. So again, could have done without that, but I still think David was a fun enough character with his love of milk and having some funny moments here and there, but he's obviously now out of the game, which is why he's here at number 9. And with that, we have 8 people left in the game to talk about. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But at number 8, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is Mary. And I feel like Mary kind of speaks for herself here, where she once again gets 0 confessionals. And I believe this is the first time since Heather in 41 to have 2 confessional episodes in the post-merge, which I think is pretty unprecedented there, and I think is a pretty bad sign for Mary not doing well moving forward. And this is despite her losing her supposed closest ally in David in this episode. Now you could say that she was shielded from this, but the fact that she gets nothing here is probably a bigger sign of her not winning than her being shielded from all this. And I think it just further reinforces what I said last week about how this relationship seems to only be coming up because it was relevant to what was happening. And I feel like Mary just doesn't have any direction on the season, where it feels like early on her story was being this underdog in the original Vula and her want to get out Say. And then after Say went, it just became her working with David. But now that David's gone, like, where is she really going on the season from a story perspective? And yes, while she could make it deeper into the game from a pure game standpoint, I just think the edit's not there. I think her getting 0 confessionals this deep into the season is a pretty bad sign and probably means that she's not winning, which is why she's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another person who I'm pretty much out on at this point, and here we have Star. And this was a pretty strange episode for Star, if I'm being honest, where she does get a personal segment where we learn that she's not very good at swimming, and you have that whole scene of everyone helping her practice. You have her saying that next time Jeff sees her, that she'll be a swimming pro, which is obviously fine content to be getting, but it doesn't feel like it adds much substance to it. I feel like we're not supposed to glean anything too deep from all this. Now, if this were in the pre-merge, like if this were in the first couple of episodes, I feel like this would be fine. But I feel like the fact that we're just getting this out of nowhere in the post-merge just feels like it was there to fill up time more than anything else. And then beyond that, you have her ultimately voting for Mitch, which is funny considering that Mitch was helping her out earlier in the episode. And yes, while it's not something that Star necessarily wanted to have happen, I feel like the way it's presented on the show just makes it seem like she's not a power player. Like she literally just says, oh, David and Mary told me that's the plan, so I guess that's what we're doing, which doesn't feel like she has much agency there. So I feel like this was not a great episode for Star, if I'm being honest. And while she could make it deeper into the game, I feel like we're not supposed to be looking at her as that serious of a threat to win the season, which is why she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have another person who I've pretty much written off at this point, and here we have Shaheen. Now, it is funny seeing the Edgic subreddit talking pretty highly about Shaheen and how even after this episode, they're still looking at him as this contender. When in reality, I was already out on him last week. I feel like last week's episode was pretty bad for him. And to be honest, I think this week was also bad for him, where I feel like a lot of his content is either him being a dodo or him just being undermined in other ways, where first up, you have him saying that he doesn't understand why Chrissy would target him when she's mad at the jocks, and how the vote was not unanimous in people's hearts, it was just unanimous on paper, which feels like more set up to a downfall, like Shaheen is going to be like this big player to be taken out later on. You have the entire scene of him catching Eva sneaking off to get her advantage, and him being worried about that, and he ends up waking up Joe to tell him about this, which leads to Joe being this foil for Shaheen, where Joe says that he's not worried about Eva, how he knows that Eva will stay true to them, and sure enough, Joe ends up being right. So I feel like that's another slight dig at Shaheen as well. And then you have the scene of him getting the credit for targeting David, which is fine until we get the flashbacks and they show Shaheen having planted these seeds about targeting David earlier. And we've seen this trick being utilized several times in A New Era, like you've seen it with Jesse from 43. And this never leads to a win. I feel like this is even more set up to Shaheen being this big player to be taken out down the road. And again, I feel like this episode just further reinforced to me that Shaheen is not winning. He is definitely not going on to win the season with the way he's been edited. And it is funny how people are still willing to hold out hope for Shaheen that he'll somehow pull out this win. But to me, I feel like last week's episode and this week's episode was just more evidence that he is not the winner of the season, which is why he's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have another person who I've pretty much written off at this point, and here we have Camila. Now, you can definitely argue that Camila should be lower than Shaheen in the sense that she's not nearly as big of a character at this point compared to Shaheen. And even so, like Camila's content still is not great, where pretty much her only content this episode is her dunking on David, calling him an idiot and how he's dead to her. And yeah, I mean, she has a point, but at the same time, it's like, I feel like the fact that that's all we get from her and how Kyle has pretty much overshadowed her in the duo just is not a great sign for me. I feel like Camila is not winning at this point. And while I can argue that Shaheen has higher highs in his edit compared to Camila, I feel like at this point, the order doesn't matter. Neither of them are winning, which is why she's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Kyle. And this was another very interesting episode for Kyle here, where he is once again getting the bulk of the content for the Kyle-Camila duo. He's being shown as this big player. And he does get a decent amount of personal content here where he does have that conversation with Joe where he talks about how he finds the entire David situation triggering and he gets to talk about his background. And again, all that's pretty good. Though at the same time, I think he also really props up Joe in the scene where he talks in particular about how he trusts Joe a lot with this information and how he sees Joe as his genuine ally. And considering that a lot of it is contextualized about the David situation and how that is seemingly wrapped up in this episode, I'm not entirely sure how this will lead to Kyle's trajectory moving forward. And I think something else to point out is I am starting to see more arguments for Kyle being a losing finalist, where Kyle's essentially been a key narrator during a lot of the season. And we've really seen Kyle like having a lot of these scenes of breaking down the fact that he's in the middle. And while it's good that he's getting like all this strategic content and him being like this narrator for the season, I also don't think it's something that leads to a win per se, and something I never loved about Kyle is the fact that he tends to prop up other people over himself, where, again, even in the scene where he's giving this personal content, he's propping up Joe for being someone that can relate to him, which I think is pretty bad there. And I've also seen some comparisons as well to Charlie from 46, who was also this big strategic narrator over the course of that season, but obviously did not go on to win and was someone that lost at the end. And I can definitely see that path for Kyle at this point. I think Kyle, like, getting the final tribal and being, like, the second place finisher would make a lot of sense here. And honestly, while that's good for Kyle from a gain standpoint, the fact that it does seem like he's set up well to get towards the end, at this point, I'm not that convinced that he'll actually go on to win the season. I feel like the show has not done a very good job of propping up why Kyle is someone we should root for to win, outside of him just coming off as a good player. So it's for that reason that I do have him here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have the same person who I had at number 3 last week, and here we have Mitch. And I thought this was a strange episode for Mitch, where he once again doesn't seem to be that big of a focus in the edit, where it feels like we are focusing so much on this 6-person alliance that Mitch is not a part of there. And yes, while Mitch does get some content during the star scene, and he also gets another confessional talking about how he's this underdog and how if you're going to go out, you have to go out swinging. I think the weird thing about Mitch is that we don't actually see him doing any of that, where you would think that with the content he's been getting that he would be this more active player and someone who is seen trying to get off the bottom, but yet we don't really see that. Where even this episode, like, he is like this secondary target, and you have the likes of David and Mary trying to flip the vote against him. And yet Mitch doesn't get any content around like trying to switch the votes. He doesn't get any credit for trying to save himself in this spot, where it feels like it's more so David doing it to himself that gets Mitch saved here. So I do feel like a lot of that's very strange, as you would think that if Mitch were the winner of the season, that they would try to prop him up here, where he's this clear underdog, and they would want to highlight that. But at the same time, I still think Mitch is someone who probably has the most upside to actually win the season out of everyone we already mentioned, and outside the top two, obviously. Where I think the biggest thing to highlight with Mitch here is he is being propped up as a threat, where we once again see in this episode people talking about how Mitch is someone who will win if he gets to the end, and how they should be taking on Mitch, and yet in this episode they don't do it, which is obviously perplexing there. And I think that's probably the one saving grace to Mitch here, is that he is at least being talked about as a threat, and he is someone who people are actively keeping around despite them saying that they should be taking Mitch out. And yes, while we've seen like people like Julie from 45 being talked about as a threat before being taken out eventually, and honestly, if I were to make a prediction, I do think that's probably where Mitch stands at this point. I do think Mitch is someone who I think we probably would expect to be a winner if he were to have like this underdog trajectory. So I do think Mitch is still someone who I am holding out a little bit of hope for, even though it's very slim, as if I'm being honest, I feel like this episode just further cemented how I feel like the rest of the season is going. But I think outside of the top two, I'm going to have Mitch here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and unsurprisingly, it is the same top 2 as last week. However, if I'm being honest, I think this episode created a lot of separation between number 1 and number 2. And while I still think number 2 has a much higher chance of winning compared to everyone we already talked about, I think their chances of winning versus number 1 has really dropped. But at number 2, I sadly had to go with Eva here. And I think this is another point of contention I have with the online community, where I've seen people on the Edix subreddit talking about how this was the breakout episode for Eva, how they feel like Eva's the one who has broken out ahead of Joe, and they're now a lot more confident that Eva will win compared to Joe. However, I actually came away from this episode with the opposite impression. I actually think this was not a great episode for Eva at all, if I'm being honest, where I feel like this episode really contradicts what Eva did even last week, where we literally saw Eva talking last week about how she got this clue to the advantage at the Taco reward, and she talked about how this would be her opportunity to break away, to have something for herself, how considering that every aspect of her game has been public between her getting the idol from Star and her having this very obvious duo with Joe, that her getting this advantage from the reward would be this opportunity to have like this trump card over Joe. But instead, she spends this episode going completely against that notion, where instead of her starting to become this more individualistic player, she has gone all in on being a team player, where she ends up getting the advantage from the reward and then immediately telling everyone about it. You have her spending so much of the episode talking about how she wants to keep the alliance together and how it's a shame that the likes of David and Mary are causing all this drama when all she wants is to be friends. And while you could say it's a positive that she's not implicating herself in the drama, the fact that she's actively talking about keeping the alliance together when it's so apparent that's about to fall apart is probably not the greatest look there as well. And then you have her spending so much of the scramble talking about how she wants to keep the alliance together, how she wants to play an honest and loyal game. And she even talks as well about how keeping David and Mary would actually be better for her game, as they have a good relationship with her. And David even confirmed in his exit interview that he wanted to go to the end with Eva. So I do feel like Eva's talks so much about wanting to keep David in the game, and then just backs out of it. She contradicts herself, which, as I talked about last week, is usually a pretty bad sign for your edit, especially in the post-merge, when you say you're going to do one thing before Tribal, but then completely do the opposite. So I do feel like Eva really undermines herself over the course of the episode. And yes, while you could say that her voting out David here is a sign that she is being this more individualistic player, I don't think it's being framed that way, where we even see as well that she reaffirms her relationship with Joe, talking about how they're together to the end. And yes, while it's clear that they probably are going to dominate the rest of the game, I feel like this episode just really undermines what Eva had set up to last week, and she ultimately contradicts herself as well. And she also just doesn't demonstrate herself as being the most forward-thinking player, where again she does talk a bit Pollyannishly about keeping the alliance together when it seems like it's about to crumble, and she talks about wanting to keep David around but then just doesn't go through with it. So I do feel like this is actually a very questionable episode for Eva in a lot of ways, and I actually think it's a much better episode for Joe, as we'll be talking about more in a moment. And at this point, I am convinced that Joe will beat Eva if they get to the end together, which I think is increasingly likely. The way I see the season playing out from this point on is that we're probably going to get a Joe, Eva, Kyle final three. And in the spot, Eva could very well be a 0 vote finalist. I could very well see that as a possibility. I think people will probably see Joe as the more alpha player, the one who is more out in front. Even though I don't think that's actually the case, I think it's pretty clear that Eva was better positioned within this alliance and that it probably was her actual decision to vet out David, even though it wasn't shown on the show. But I do think at the end of the day, I think Joe is someone who will inherently get more of the credit for the moves that they were doing. And I think this episode exposed a lot of cracks in Eva's at this point. And yes, while I could be wrong, while I could be misreading a lot of this, I am simply giving my honest opinion here. I don't walk away from this episode with the same assessment that other people seem to be having here. And it wouldn't shock me if Joe continues to go uphill over the course of the season while Eva starts to slide downwards, sort of similar to what we saw with Carolyn versus Jam Jam. So I do think at this point, I think I'm probably higher on Joe, and I'll talk about Joe more in a moment. But at this point, I'm just not feeling as great about an Eva win, which is a shame as I do like Eva a lot, and I would personally would rather see her win. But again, that's just not the read that I'm getting at this point. So it's for that reason that I do ever hear a number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 48 at this point is still Joe. And again, not too surprising here. And I actually think this was a much better episode for Joe than it was for Eva here, where I do think Joe gets a lot of decent content here, where first up, you have Shaheen telling him about Eva sneaking off to get the advantage, and him immediately undermining Shaheen by saying that he's not worried about Eva, how he knows that Eva will be a team player, and that she'll have the Alliance's best interest at heart. And sure enough, the very next day, Eva just tells the Alliance about the advantage and gets to affirm that. You have the entire scene of Kyle, like, talking with Joe about the David situation, and Kyle just really sharing his personal background with Joe, and also getting the prop up Joe by talking about how Joe is someone that he really likes and how he really trusts him with this information. And I feel like that's another scene that is the show going out of its way to prop up Joe even more. You have his conversation with David, where David approaches him about the previous vote, and David accusing Joe going back on his word, and to which Joe gets pretty defensive about that. And while from a pure gain standpoint, I don't love this aspect, and I think it just further highlights the issue of playing like this honorable game, and that it forces you to get more defensive and to get into like these like debates over what is a lie and what is going back on your word that can really expose you as his hypocrite. I think if we're taking it from an edit standpoint, I think the show is backing up Joe here, where I think the edit is making us believe that Joe's in the right for the situation and how David's being paranoid and unreasonable and just pushing away allies here. So I actually think this is probably more of a positive for Joe than anything else. And I think on top of that, he doesn't really contradict himself, where I think the show makes it clear from early on that Joe wants to target David at some point, and we really see his process of doing so, where he checks in with Eva, he has that conversation with her to really get into her head that they should consider like whether to target David or Mitch. And it's not like Joe ever says, oh, we need to keep the alliance together. I feel like Joe is shown in a pretty consistent way in terms of how he eventually decides to vote out David here. So I do think at the end of the day, I think this was a very strong episode for Joe in the sense that we do see him like playing in a somewhat consistent way to what we're being shown. I think he's someone who isn't really getting too involved in the drama, not really being overexposed. But at the same time, the show is still going out of its way to prop up Joe at every opportunity. Like, again, the whole Kyle situation, you have him like getting these confessionals after winning immunity, talking about how the old dad still has it. I do think at this point, this episode did create separation between Joe and Eva. I think Joe is much more likely to win the season at this point than everyone else. And I think he's now more likely to win the season than Eva. And obviously, yes, while things could still change, I think I am pretty confident at this point that we are getting set up to Joe and Eva getting towards the end together in a position to where they dominate the game. And I do think with the way the show has been presenting everything, that Joe has more of the setup to actually beat Eva at the end. So I think it's for those reasons that I am more confident now that Joe will win the season, and because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now we'll be back again next week to update the Power Rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm still doing videos on the Amazing Race and doing Power Rankings on that, so be on the lookout for that. I am on Patreon and have YouTube memberships, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.